Hey everyone, welcome to this lesson. This is a bonus section where I actually want to tell you about my coloring process. The first thing I do is I move my sketch onto a canvas, and in this case I'm using the aquarelle canvases, or the cold pressed one from Lisa Glantz, and then I alpha lock the layer with my sketch and pass over with a brush with this brownish warm color so that my line work feels more like kind of closer to the skin tone, because I decided that the fairy will have a human skin tone. The next step is to outline the whole character and then to fill in that outline. This is going to give me the opportunity to paint only on the layer where the character is, not being worried about going outside the lines. So I'm using a brush that's slightly textured for the outline so that the outline doesn't seem very flat, so the edge of the outline doesn't seem very flat. And after I'm done with outlining it, I am going to fill it in by using the bucket tool in the Procreate, just by dragging the color inside. And then I also need to make sure, you will see that I am going to turn it into black so that I can clearly see which parts of the outline did not fill in correctly, because usually when you use a textured brush, there is a downside to it that on the inside, when you're filling in, even if you increase the strength of the fill by dragging the pencil to the right side, you will still see that there are some areas that didn't fill in quite right. And the best way to check that your shape is correctly outlined and filled is by turning it into a very contrasting color to your background, and this way you will see all those areas that need to be filled in. In this case, I'm using black and I'm passing with the same brush, basically just to fill up those white areas and to be sure that my character doesn't have any bold spots when I put the color on top of it, because I will be using this shape as my main selection tool and as my layer for the clipping masks. I like to create the selection in my favorites when I select that layer, and I add the plus icon so that I have only the layer selected and I don't have to go and select that particular layer every time. I can just go into the selection tool and select the favorite layers, favorite selections, sorry. And then I can already start coloring. But before, what I do is I copy the texture of the paper and I fill it in completely with the white, or you can just directly fill in with the white the selection that you have created so that you can start coloring on top. As I'm using watercolor technique, and in this tutorial here I was using the aquarelle brushes by Lisa Glantz, the second version. I have both of them. I am filling in without being worried that I'm going to go outside the lines. As I said, using the clipping mask at first, and then I will just simply remove the unnecessary parts when I select and invert my shape and just do clear layer. That's going to make sure that all the color stays only in the selected area. Also, I like this technique when you create kind of a smudge of color and you put it on overlay on top of all the layers, so that this smudge of color, for example, in Lisa Glantz's brushes, she has these kind of painted textures that you can also scan and make your own. This helps create that feeling of watercolor paint, because I try to make the focal point the warmest, especially where the skin tones are, as in yellow or warm orange, but the other sides of the painting, which are not the focal point, I make them cooler in tone so that you have these brush strokes still kind of visible. It's very subtle, but it's a very interesting effect and gives you a lot of variety in color. And the next steps is I am just playing around with the colors. I have created this illustration using a tetradic color scheme, which means that you have 4 colors either in a square or a perpendicular on the color wheel. and I decided that I'm going to be using the 4 different colors, but you have to make sure that one of the colors is the dominant one, and in this case it's yellows and greens, and the rest of the colors are only the supporting role. And now I will let you see how I create the base layer, and also I make sure that the areas that need more that need to be more kind of thicker, more tone heavy, I pass various times over them, not using the darker color, but no, I'm using this bright color that I need, and then I am passing several times on top of it. And with Lisa Glance's brushes, also there is a thing that they leave an edge if you lift your brush, or in this case your pencil, off of the paper. You have to then blend them if you would like that more blended effect. So there's no problem, there are the blenders. I love her brush packs. So Adels and Farias and Lisa Glance are my favorite watercolor brush experts. And yeah, I will let you watch now how I fill in the main layers. And as you can see, in the beginning I was thinking of making the t-shirt kind of purple, but eventually, as you go along, you will see that you always make changes. You switch your mind into a completely different way of thinking. And in this case, I decided that I wanted my t-shirt to be not as cool green, not as blue-green as the leaves themselves, but to be green in a warmer tone. So this way I could also make sure that the colors just don't overpower it. So I have the purple in my wings and only in the cup. And she turned out to be a strawberry juice fairy. So yeah, I will let you watch how I'm finishing in with the base layer, okay? Another cool thing about digital watercolor is that you can always erase it where you make a mistake or where you go out of line, and that definitely makes it a lot easier, because what happens with watercolor, it's a very unforgiving medium. Yes, it creates these beautiful effects and it creates awesome mistake opportunities, but when you're only beginning with watercolor, that is difficult. So digital watercolor for an illustrator, for a picture book illustrator, sometimes if you need to make it more neat, digital watercolor definitely for me is the way. But I also love the traditional media, and the brand of watercolor that I'm using when I paint traditionally is the Sennelier brand. That's the only one that actually has honey in it, and it makes the colors very transparent. So that's like one of the best watercolors I can actually advise for anyone to get. After I'm done with the base layer, what I like to do is I like to select areas of each layer, and I like to do the feathering and change the tone of the color and the hue just slightly, maybe also the saturation, so that it creates that variation. When watercolor flows on the paper, it creates these different areas which are more bright and less bright, and more saturated, more pigment coming together and less pigment. So this is kind of imitating the thing. And now you can see me that I'm selecting every layer, and I'm selecting my saved silhouette, so that I can actually cut these layers to a point where they perfectly fit into the shape that I created. So the basic shape that I needed underneath was to make sure that all the layers don't go out of the shape itself, and then I can already apply some multiply layers on top and clipping them to those layers exactly. With the face, as I was trying to paint the face, it was becoming patchy and yellow, and I was like, what is happening there? And then I remembered that I have the overlay texture with the brush strokes, but you can avoid this by actually selecting the areas where you don't want it, and you can either lower the opacity in those areas, or you can straight delete and clear the layer of that texture right in those areas. Especially when it's skin, you don't want the skin to be patchy. And then already in the multiply layers on using the clipping mask, I start creating those blushes with basically the same color. And here I messed a bit with the brush so that it gives me a bit more hue variation. That means color variation when I paint with it. So every time I lift my pencil and I start painting again, it's going to slightly shift the hue. This way I go over all the layers and I create the painterly effect of adding more watercolor textures as well as more color into the layers. Also, I wanted to mention that I wanted her hair to become kind of greenish at the tips. I wanted to create that ombre effect because I thought that that's gonna be cool. But in the end, I eventually ended up with having only the tips slightly green. And as I said, as you go, you will start noticing that you are changing your mind about the decisions that you make, and you might change some things cardinally, and that is perfectly okay. That's the best thing about creating art, is that while you go, you can completely change your mind and go into the other direction, and it's just gonna make the thing look better, not worse, always. As I like to make my shadows purple, that's just because I like to create warm light very often on my illustrations. I add in multiply layer, I add the colors that is basically light purple to the shadow areas. And first of all, in watercolor, that's going to create a new hue, new color, and it's going to also darken the areas but make them kind of with this purplish undertone. So, but in the hair, if I add purple, that's gonna make it very dirty. So I need to be careful. I need to see which colors fit well with the hair. And in this case, it's the orangish kind of yellow and greenish colors, because otherwise the purple and yellow, when you mix them together, they create mud and they create gray. And here I'm trying out different textures so that I can, and I'm not afraid, as I said, to go outside the lines, because I select my saved selection and just clear everything that is outside of that selection by pressing clear on the layer. So here I already work with the selection tool so that I can add the textures to different clumps of hair, and that makes life way easier because you don't go into the areas where you don't want to add that texture. Another trick when using digital watercolor I wanted to teach you is the fact that you can actually take erasers and pass over different areas, creating that appearance of the smudges of color where they are more intense, so where the pigment kind of accumulates, and then when the areas of paper or with more water, it kind of pushes the pigment away, and this is where you erase them. So you use the eraser that is a paintbrush with texture, and that's gonna work perfectly well. I'm also adding the deeper greens into the shadow areas of my skirt. So it's made out of leaves, and I make sure that the leaves that are underneath, they are darker than the leaves that are on top. So basically the area that's kind of going underneath something is always going to be darker than the area that is facing the light. And in this case, I create multiple layers. First I create the general shadow under the apron, and then I select each leaf and I start making the shadows more intense under each leaf. And then I decided that maybe I want my tips to be yellow and kind of replicate that hair that is yellow with green tips, and on the skirt I will have green leaves with the yellow tips. This is another great trick I learned from Adelson Farias. And basically what he does, he selects a brush with a very defined edge, and he starts creating those shapes that represent veins in the leaf. So I was trying different approaches here, seeing what works better, and eventually I started creating the translucent. So this brush is quite transparent, but with green color nonetheless, with a slightly different kind of hue of the green. And I am creating those veins that look amazing, to my mind at least. And this is a very cool trick you can use on wings, on leaves, on greenery, because it makes it instantly look more detailed, more interesting. And it's basically just adding one more layer, with this layer already having that hue variation. As the skirt is green, I decided that the brown doesn't fit. It just tore my eye out when I was looking at the brown next to the green. So I decided to go over the line work. I put it into Alpha Lock, and I went over the line work and made the lines on the skirt green. The same goes for the hair and other elements, that I recolored my line work as if it was drawn with colored pencils. So basically the hair had a more orangier tone to it than the line work on the skin. As you can see on the bow, I go through the same process of adding layers and then also using the eraser with the same textured brush. And then I also wanted to make the hue a bit more cheerful, a bit more red instead of pink. So yeah, with the bow, I was trying to make it kind of, as this illustration is all about happiness and being strawberry-like, I decided to make it more reddish, more warmer, to give it this kind of illusion of warmth for the whole illustration in general, because it's a very accentuated piece of accessory on her hair that contrasts very much with the green in her hair. I continue then with the rest of my drawing, painting, and I add the same way as I did with all the previous areas. I add more layers, more shadows, and then especially I go into cooler shadows. In this case, if it's a brown, which is an acorn, kind of this ladle, I go into cooler areas and I add purple shadows where they fit, where they will not create a kind of dirty grayish look. as previously with the leaves, here in the dragonfly wings, I decided to add the same texture with the same hard-edged brush that is quite translucent, but I had to actually go and look for a reference of how approximately the dragonfly wings look, because you think you know it, but no, you don't. So I had to actually look it up, and I was creating a similar kind of drawing of those veins as I saw in the reference pictures, basically from a photo of a dragonfly. And also with the line, as you can see, for now it's still brown. I will change the line of the wings as well, going into the layer with the line work and adding the color to the alpha locked layer as purple, so that it doesn't stand out as if she has this kind of dark outline on her wings. I decided to make her eyebrows green because I thought that any shade of yellow in this case is just gonna get lost. And most importantly, the eyes, I outlined them with a darker color just to make sure that those are the center of, like, the focal point of my illustration, because the eyes is the first thing that we actually look at as human beings. I didn't want to draw the second pair of wings, but then I thought, what if I just copy it and make it less transparent and put it in the back, so that we do see that there is the second pair of wings, that she doesn't look like as she has only 2 wings, but at the same time we have them so subtle in the background that they are not bothering us at all. For the shadows, when I'm working with the watercolor in Procreate, I like to add smudges of watercolor already that are pre-made, or even with just a brush, to actually add the shadow underneath, and I like to make it purple, of course. And then I was testing out different brushes which would fit into the whole thing of freckles, and eventually I went with Procreate brushes that come with Procreate by default, and those are just the water droplets, and they look amazing as freckles. The next step is to get rid of that outline, and what I do usually is I don't erase the line on the outsides of my shapes, but I take the local color of the line, of the inside on the shape, and I cover the line work with that local color. And here I was first trying to do that with the paper texture, but then I understood that it's bothering me, so I switched the paper texture off and I started adding that color with a brush that I love. That's a scribbler brush. It's basically like a pencil brush, and I'm cleaning up the lines, and where I see the shadow, I'm using this same color of the line to actually intensify the shadow by scribbling in and then blending in with the same brush, just by color picking and then scribbling in back and forth until I get a pleasant gradient. This also helps me clean up the shapes, and it helps me bring the parts of the, for example, the hair here forward, and the hair in the back, push it kind of backwards by making it darker. And this is one of my favorite techniques, which I've learned from Poopy Cat, who's Kate Pellerin. She uses this technique to actually work on all of her illustrations by kind of scribbling in that pencil and replicating the colored pencil on paper. In some areas, like here on the hair, I didn't need that green line, and I decided that I'm gonna erase the line work. When what I will do is I will just fix the shape by using my scribbler brush, that is the colored pencil brush, to actually fix the area of the hair to just give it a more precise shape. as I'm doing here on the ear. I'm just selecting the color that is on the ear and just covering that line so that I can have a more defined shape and a more pleasant kind of overall view for the eye, so it's not that messy. And I go this way all over my painting. So basically it takes time, yes, but I really like the end result because it makes the painting more crisper and it still gives it that watercolor feel with colored pencils laid over the top. And you can also mix colors and it creates beautiful hues when you mix those colors, mix and match, and you can also take it from other areas of the painting sometimes. I do that and I add those colors into the areas where there were none. Especially the line work is very cool because when you have the line work and multiply, you can select the colors of the line work to create more deeper shadows. Sometimes when I see that there is not enough contrast between two areas of an illustration, especially I like to darken up my tips of the hair as well, I use this color that I created from the line work with the yellow, and I separate the forehead, for example, from the hair that is behind it. So the hair is a bit darker. And as you can see, I continue cleaning up the lines, and in this case, as I wasn't drawing any background and I wanted my whole illustration to have kind of a whitish halo around it, I was not erasing the parts which were outside the area of my shape, but what I did instead is I used white color and just covered up the areas with the white color, so that white color, yeah, it's a color, so that I could clean up the shapes better. One more thing that I can suggest is always kind of make your canvas small and look at your whole picture while you are rendering it in whole. So how does it look from afar? Usually, as this is kind of a picture book illustration, you might see it quite large on an image, or you might see it quite small. So I need to make sure that every part of it is readable. I always make sure to kind of move away from my painting, and in this case I can't move away like physically, so I make the canvas smaller so that I can look at it from afar and see if there's enough difference between lights and darks. When it comes to hands, I really like to get rid of the line that is on the outside of the fingers, but I like to keep that line separating the fingers from the rest of the hand that I have already made. I really like to use it as the separator line so that I don't have to think what color to use there to separate one finger from the other. And in this case, I left the original line work as the color that separates fingers in between themselves. One more tip I can give you to make those grasses and leaves more juicy and more kind of warmish is to use the yellow color but in dark shade when it creates that beautiful warm yellow. So greens are sometimes quite difficult in an illustration, and sometimes you can make them too cold, but I found that the best warm green is actually yellow but dark. I use the local color of the leaf, so I'm constantly color picking, and I am getting rid of that outline so that I don't lose the shape of my leaf, because if I were to erase the line color, it's going to immediately the shape is going to be less readable, so I need to make sure that it's quite visible, the shape of each leaf and also of my wings. And what I do then is I add a bit more of darker greens to separate the leaves even more, not just with the watercolor but also with the texture of the pencil. Fortunately or not, this is how I create textures. This is really a lot of work if you think about it, but it's very therapeutical. You basically are coloring in, and what you're doing is you're just scribbling and color picking because you already have those initial base colors there. And here I need to make one remark about the legs. So when I was building the character, the next day that I looked at it, and I was actually being I got pointed out that her legs are too short. So I have a different little video that shows how to actually fix your mistakes when you already have rendered your illustration, and at least how to render it in this style and then fix it. So I am totally okay with admitting my own mistakes. I am not perfect. So here, when I was creating the character, I don't know how, but she came out with orangutan arms. I think because when you draw and when you talk at the same time, sometimes your brain doesn't work in the full capacity thinking about building stuff. So maybe next time I should record the video first and then talk afterwards. But yeah, you will see the video about how to correct the whole thing. separately, okay? So don't worry, you can check that out and you can correct, and you will also know how to correct your own characters, just in case if you make a mistake of rendering it and then you look at it the next day, even with all the canvas flipping and so on, you just sometimes your eyes get so blurry you don't see it. So here, yeah, definitely check out the correction bonus video. Also, you might notice that on the legs I am not, and on the feet especially, I'm not working any details or anything. I just added 2 leaves to the one of the straps, but this is not my focal point. So here I'm not going into different hue variations and going into this different kind of adding too much texture and adding too much different colors. Here is not my focal point. That is something that is away from my focal point. It doesn't mean that it has to be neglected, but you have to make sure that your focal point stays in the center stage, and the rest of the illustration goes kind of further away. It's not as important, not as contrasting, and definitely not the focal point, okay? So this is one of the ways how to avoid having the viewer lost, because everything is drawn so perfectly and so meticulously in detail that he doesn't know where to actually look at. And finally, I wanted to add some background to my character, and this is one of the stamps that I used, and I lowered the opacity, or in this case I just went brighter, and then I was looking at the colors which I actually like, and I think that the blue in this case, kind of this blue of the sky, it makes it seem as if she's outside and just pouring the juice for little critters to drink. So this strawberry juice from an acorn ladle, and maybe it's the sky color, so I don't know, it kind of gives it more cheerfulness, especially next to that yellow of the hair. And yeah, this is it. This is my rendering process. I hope you enjoyed this.